almost about that time. Right about now.
Right about now. Funk, bunk, 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 soul brother.
Hal Hershfield, welcome to the Right About Now podcast.
Hey, thanks, Jonathan. I'm happy to be here.
I'm very excited to talk to you and kind of journey, get in our time travel machine and journey and meet our future self. There's so many examples you give in the book of sort of like opening a gate and then you're presented with your future self. I think before we get into this, I just want to get a little bit of an understanding of like what you do for a living. Like what is your job?
Yeah, well, I mean, most of my friends don't think I actually have one because I show up to work looking like this. But no, I'm I'm a professor at UCLA's Anderson School of Management. So I'm a marketing and behavioral decision making professor, but I also have an appointment in the psych department. So my PhD is in psychology, so I study a lot of decision making. But I teach at the business school, and then I do some consulting and research with outside companies as well. But like my big focus is on trying to figure out, why people have a hard time making the decisions that they want to make, making the choices that they want to make, and how to help them do better.
Yeah. Oh man, I could use your
Well,
your guidance on that.
I could too.
So your book, Future Self, let before we start talking about future self, I think it's important that we sort of have a baseline understanding of what you mean when you talk about future self. Can you define the future self for us here?
Yeah, absolutely. So to some extent it is a very abstract concept.
Yeah. Yes.
Of course, on the surface, it's any version of you that exists, at some point in time in the future.
Mm-hmm.
However, you can get more specific because part of what really matters is the goals that we're thinking of. So if I have a goal of let's say I have a goal of saving a certain amount of money so that I can buy a new car or, laughably afford a down payment in LA or something like that, right? There's a specific time point I've got in mind. Well, now I'm thinking about a future self in 2 or 3 years or 10 years or 15 years or whatever it is. I could also have a future self in 6 months, where I'm saying, okay, I really want to get this, this project done. Let's say I've got like a sort of a big article I'm trying to write and I want to get that done in 6 months. There's a me at the other side of that.
Yeah.
What becomes interesting is that, of course, there's a lot of little selves along the way. Like if my goal is to finish that project in 6 months, I can't just sort of snap my fingers and wake up then and hope that it's done, right? I've got to figure out, well, what does tomorrow look like? And then the day after tomorrow and so on, so that I can make a sort of a smoother connection between my present self and that eventual future self.
Right. And the future self, like you said, it's not like one person. It's not like it's like many people, right? Like explain that, what you mean by that.
Yeah. So this gets complicated, right? So we have many possible future selves, right? There's a version of me that stays. I live in LA now, and there's this future self that stays here and
Right.
doesn't move. There's another version that maybe eventually moves back east, and so on and so on. And then there's also different future selves according to different arenas that I'm operating in. Whether it's my professional life or my personal one, or my writing life or my health life, or whatever it might be, right? And then there's all the sort of selves along the way. I really think, for the sake of keeping things a little bit straightforward and simple, that we try to, focus on one thing at a time and constrain our thinking to, one possible future self. If we have a goal of getting to some sort of, accomplishment,
Mm-hmm.
let's focus on that first and think about the steps along the way. And I know that we'll kind of get into this, of course.
Right.
But even though there can be many future selves, it may be easier to sort of, pump the brakes and think about one.
So is this like, for example, like this is the professional, like this is my career future self, like this is what I'm doing in 20 years kind of future self.
Yeah. So we could definitely have that one, right? You could, I mean, you could even make it a little easier and let's go with 5 years, right? 20 years, man.
20 years is tough. Especially for me.
My office is on the moon. I don't know,
Yeah, exactly. So even a 5-year future self. Yeah. And that, and you
Yeah,
can, yeah, an example might be like, what am I doing? Where am I living? What is my financial situation? That kind of thing.
yeah, and who am I spending my time with, and how am I
Yep.
spending my time, and what are my values? Um, those are the deeper things that I think can really sort of propel that conversation forward. Because otherwise, it can get really hard, when, especially, I think, many of us have intimately realized how much uncertainty there is in the world over the last couple of years. Um, so, one recommendation I have, for what it's worth, and this is based on some new research by some other researchers, Charles Chu and Brian Lowry, is to focus on the things that you can expect to happen.
Mhm.
If you focus on the surprising things, all of a sudden life becomes very unpredictable. But if I say, okay, what can I expect to be true in 5 years? Okay, I think there's a couple of things I can point to, and a lot of those have to do with my own values and
Yeah.
my sort of preferences, even though they could change. But let's try to constrain it to the stuff that might be similar.
I always wonder, sometimes I think about my past self. Like very
Yeah.
recently, I came across some photos of myself in fifth grade performing a rock concert on my street, and there was all these pictures in the background. You see all these kids that I hadn't thought about in 30 years, and I started wondering, like, who was I to those kids?
Yeah.
Back then, was I the same person that I am now? Like fundamentally, like obviously,
Yeah.
I'm not, whatever where I was then, 13 years old. But I think, and I know you think about this a lot too. It's like, does one kind of core of you remain the same throughout all the different iterations
Yeah.
of your life?
It's a question I love grappling with. And it's funny
Yeah.
because, well, gosh, I guess it was 5, 6 years ago. No, gosh, whatever. 6 years ago, I remember going back for my high school 20th reunion.
Yeah.
And it was very funny because, I was there with my wife, and she, of course, didn't know me then. And it was a really interesting exercise in thinking about, and I grew up, most of those people I'd gone to kindergarten with, and
Yeah.
I grew, and they knew a version of me. And I kept thinking throughout that night, which parts of me now, would they
Yeah. The
still know? And
same.
which parts of me which parts would
I
they
know.
say, I didn't know that guy? And, I mean, there's fascinating research on this. There's, some really interesting, um, sort of personality science that suggests that it's a real, it's really complex. There's certain things that do stay relatively stable over time.
Yeah.
And there's certain things that change. Psychologists talk about the big five personality traits. Are you open to experience, are conscientious, extroverted, agreeableness, and neuroticism? And in a 10-year period, one of those can actually change a decent amount. There's like a good chance, but four of them remain relatively stable, right? So it's like, depending on which part of the puzzle you look at, you get a different answer. Um, when we think about other people being, quote unquote, the same over time, what researchers have found in terms of the thing that matters is what they call core moral traits, or the essential moral traits. Basically, what are the sort of defining features of you that, I could point to, sort of the moral core of you, or I don't know, maybe you're like a friendly guy, but also like a little sarcastic, or
Yeah. Yeah.
whatever it is, right? And there's can be so many surface level changes, but if those things stay the same, like if you were to get together with your, eighth grade friends, and you make a joke that's sort of in line with that same sense of humor, they'd probably say like, yeah, that's the same old, that's the same
Yeah.
old
Same old
Jonathan,
John.
even though you live in LA now rather than New York, all those big changes.
Right. You would never know. So I was kind of taught growing up, and I had a very unusual upbringing in terms of, like, my parents had a kind of a spiritual teacher, like a guru,
Wow.
who yeah, talk about a years of therapy. But one of the things that he emphasized, and it's something that certainly has actually become very popularized now, is sort of the power of now, right? The power of
Yeah.
living in the moment, the power of the
Yeah.
present. And it's a kind of a Buddhist idea. Um, he changed it a bit, but let's just say that he always said the future was sort of just a fantasy. The past and the future are just projections in your mind, that they're not real. So why focus on them, right? Uh, do you agree with that? Obviously you don't, to some degree, because, this idea that there's only the now, you know,
Hmm.
um, not to get too so philosophical and
No. I love
but
it.
yeah, but how do you think, like, why is it important then to sort to think about the future itself, like in that?
No, yeah. So for what it's worth, I don't disagree. And I actually think that there's a world in which the sort of two philosophies can come together. The idea of, there's only the now. In some ways, there's truth to that, right? Like
Right.
we're
There's only
the
this
only
moment.
time that we're only living in the present.
Right.
And I think there's also a great deal of importance to the idea that we be present in the present moment. We be there for it, so that, so that we don't miss out on things. And also that also does a service to our future selves, right? Because if we're walking around sort of not focused and not really absorbing in what's happening, I don't think that sets up a good scenario for our future selves either, right? So I don't, my interpretation of this sort of line of thought isn't that one should be sort of hedonistic, right? There's a version of living in the now that is totally hedonistic, and there's no tomorrow, and I might as well do whatever I want. And I don't think a Buddhist
No, I don't think that was the philosophy. No, I don't think that was the idea behind that.
Right. And one can be I don't know if this is going to sound weird, but one can be present in planning for the future, right? Like I can be dialed in, like, and think about that, and also at the same time live my life today. So I actually think that, it would be a mistake to somehow, only live for the future, right? Or to only live in a way that ignores the future, that, you're so present that you're just like, we'll see what happens. Like, I just can't
then
think.
you have no responsibility to anything but the now, right? It's like that's the kind of idea that, like, you're at the end of days or something, so nothing we do now matters, because there is no future. And that, I feel like that's very irresponsible. There's also,
and I think, I'll go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, when you have kids, I think you have kids, right? Like,
yes,
they're the future, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, by being so present, but there's that balance of, like, worrying. Maybe worrying is the wrong word, but planning for the future and being too in the future. Is what's that John Lennon quote, like, the life is what happens when we make plans, like, well, we're making plans or something like that. The idea of planning for the future, but also being present, so you're enjoying what's happening now. So tell me the importance of the difference between, like, why is it important to, your work is so focused on the future self. So why is that so important for that to be part of our experience and knowing about it and understanding how we relate to it?
Yeah, I mean, everything you've been saying, it really resonates with me, because I think it's important to recognize, and I'll get to your question in a second. I think it's really important to recognize that there's different modes of what we call perspection, right? Thinking ahead to the future. Anxiety is a form of perspection, right? Because I'm thinking, yes,
yeah, exactly. That's my thing.
Guilty.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm I don't know whether it's my background or whatever it is. I'm prone to this too, right? And I'm prone to sort of obsessively worrying about things, to the point where I say, God, I missed out on the present because I was anxious about something moving forward. And I realized, gosh, I could have I could have, like, squeezed more out of the moments I had, rather than, like, just focus on the future. So, my research is it's not about, like, just thinking about the future for the sake of, for future's sake, right? It's really about setting up a stronger relationship with our future selves, so that when we make decisions now, there's some, gosh, this is going to sound really like Southern California to me, but there's, like, some, like, intentionality devoted to, plan making and decisions, right? And so I think it's easy, the title of my book is, Your Future Self. And I think it would be easy to see that and think that the message is all about, sacrifice today and live for tomorrow. And that is, like, just really not it. In fact, when I was, like, working on earlier versions, one of my buddies here who's in Hollywood and, does a lot of production, was like, nobody wants to just sacrifice. And I was like, no, but that's not the point. He's like, well, you got to make that point clear. And, because it's really about understanding this sort of balance, or someone actually recently said to me, harmony between my present self and my future self. So, sometimes my present self gets to be the star. Sometimes I do things and my future self gets to be the star. But the problem arises when like we have tunnel vision, we're only focused on right now. And then we look up and we say, shit, I wish I had, or sorry, I wish I had
You can say
done
shit,
X,
it's
Y,
okay.
and Z.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I wish I had done X, Y, and Z in the
Yeah.
past, right? And so those are the problems that I'm trying to solve,
Right.
or at least make a little bit easier.
Well, so let's get into some of your, because you're really, not only you trying to solve them, but you do a tremendous amount of research. I mean, I don't even know where to start because there's so many studies that you did. You did a very interesting study early on in your career about retirement, right? And
Yeah.
trying to get people. Can you explain what that was and what you learned? Because I think that is very instructive to understanding kind of what you mean here.
Yeah. So early on, look, the nut I've been trying to crack is, how do you get people to do a little more today for tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
So I had started in the sort of retirement space because it's
That's
to some
future.
extent and it's like it's a little easy to it's quantifiable. It's like easy to pull across. It's like a social problem, but it's, I mean, admittedly, and part of the problem is that it's boring to think about,
Right.
like when you say the word retirement, nobody's like, oh, sweet, let's jam
It's
out about
true.
that, right?
That is so true. Even when we write
um
about it in Entrepreneur, we never say retirement. It's always like planning for your future. It's
right,
always like, yeah,
right,
you can't. It's a little
exactly. And it
loaded.
is a funny thing because like in some ways, how awesome like should it be that like you could work hard and then have a period of time where you do
Yeah.
something different. I mean, also part of the problem is that the notion of retirement from the you know middle and early 20th century is very different now. The idea that you'd sit on your porch with lemonade and golf
Yeah.
occasionally and
Yeah. Go to
then
the
like
old Hague home in
die.
Florida. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like
Yep.
that's not retirement.
Yeah.
But anyway, part of the problem was how do you get people to literally put some more money aside for that period of time because it's so necessary now. Psychologically, one of the barriers there is that people don't really relate to that distant future self. They see it as a different person, and yet it's a different person who they don't connect to. It's like, it's like I know they exist, but I'm not really doing much for them. So early on, one of the things we're trying to do is say, like, how can I tighten up that connection? How can I improve that relationship? One thing that we know from other work is, if you want to try to improve a relationship, you can make the other party more vivid, heighten up, dial up their emotions, right? So, I mean, this is like the classic example from charity. Charitable organizations, they know that if they tell you a whole bunch of stats, it's just like,
That's
nobody cares
interesting.
about that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, not nobody cares, but
But it doesn't
it's
make
not
as much an
emotional.
impact. Yeah. And it's the same with journalism. If you keep giving people a ton of data, but you don't give actually one example of somebody who's, whatever, having an experience that you're talking about. Yeah. Then it becomes kind of just a bunch of numbers. People like the human, like the singular approach. So what did the charities do?
Absolutely. Well, yeah. And I mean, what the charities do is they show you a picture. they tell
Yeah.
you they tell you a story, or they tell you how specifically how your donation is going to do. Like, what is it specifically going to do? It's going to buy this thing for this person, or, it's going to go to this particular group. I mean, you guys, journalists, you're so good at this in a way that academics are really not, right? Like academics think like the thing to do is to give all the data. And it's like, you can't put someone to sleep faster,
Yeah.
and
No, well, you would be
go ahead.
surprised how many people make the mistake of doing a lot of data, and you're always like, can you just give me one example? I mean, I'm thinking of like, we write a lot about side hustles. And
Yes.
like, if you just wrote a whole story about how many side hustles people are doing and how people have made $500 million in side hustles in 2023, and all, it would just be the most boring story. But if you have one story about one person who's doing a side hustle and how much money they made and what they did and how you can do it too, that is so much more effective. So it's the
It's
same,
so
I
much more
guess, with
effective.
charity, right? So you
Yeah.
show a person, who needs help. I remember I used to be, and I'm almost, it's sort of sad now. There's this charity called Save the Children, which I feel like has been co-opted by QAnon, unfortunately. I don't even, it
Yeah.
hasn't really been, but they kind of bastardized the message of that
Right.
charity. But it was that charity, the whole thing was that you would sponsor one child.
Yep.
And I would communicate with that child. And it was wonderful. I had this kid in Mali, and he would write me back and say what he did today. And I think it was true. I mean, the writing, seemed like it was from a kid. And I mean, it wasn't, sometimes it was a teacher translating, but whatever. It was like, it made a difference. They'd send me pictures. So that worked very effective on me. And again, not in a manipulative way, but it just was real to me.
Well, yeah, and I think look, it's really important to say not in a manipulative way, because I think, anytime, I mean, this is marketing, right? Anytime I do something that gets you to change your behavior, you can say, well, it's for good, or it's for manipulative or nefarious purposes. And that, in this case, I wouldn't say so. Look, we took those same lessons. By the way, there's a term for this, it's called scope and sensitivity, when I almost ignore the data points about the thousands, tens of thousands of kids, or the hundreds of thousands of workers, but pay more attention to the singular. It's like, because the singular is more emotional. So, the version of this when it comes to planning is, oftentimes you hear this, it's important to plan, it's important to save, and let me show you the compound interest chart. And all of that is abstract. It's equivalent to the, giving a bunch of data points. But then the story or the picture is a lot more emotional. So early on, we played around with age progression technology to, show people, okay, here's a model of what you would look like in the future. Now, when we first did this, we also used virtual reality. We put people into a VR environment, and they come face to face with a virtual mirror, and they see their older self, right? Or they see their younger self. And okay, lo and behold, we show that leads people to be more willing to donate to retirement. And we've followed this up with real studies in the real world, with real dollars and cents, I should say. The gist there is that you're just painting a clearer picture. I mean, it's funny, as we record this, right? TikTok has recently introduced one of these aging filters.
Oh wow,
and it's like, yeah, I mean, and to clarify, like, I'm not on it, but
it's kind of funny because the people who are on it are all like my kids' age, and it's like, what do they need an aging filter so they look 3 years old? Yeah,
it's really funny, right? And that is who's on it, right? And I'm not saying, oh, that's going to get a whole bunch of Gen Zers to save for the future, right? Because it's not like it's paired with their bank account or their savings account or whatever, but it's the technology is remarkable. I've sort of scrolled and gone deep into some of these, and people are really, it's like really emotional to see what people do when they see their older selves there, right? So so it's sorry, this is a really long
because
answer.
you used back in the day, you used a technology that was available then, right?
Exactly.
So talk about that for your
and so I mean, that back then we were working with graphic artists and sort of off the shelf type, a couple
technology.
Different software packages, and it was all meant to mimic the aging experience. But now, I mean, anyone can do this. You upload a photo and it's like, boom. And
so what did you do? So you showed people, so back to your experiment, you showed people images of themselves when they were older, right?
Yeah. So this is the one. Yeah. So we had a virtual reality setup.
Yeah.
And half of the people would go into the room, and they would come face to face with their future selves and have a conversation. The other half of our research participants did the exact same thing, but they come face to face with just a digital avatar of themselves today. And then the folks who saw their future selves, they were more willing to donate to a long-term savings account. We followed it up with a couple of studies doing this, not in VR, but online. And then we recently followed this up with a study in Mexico, where this was with like 50,000 bank consumers, where half of them get these messages about saving, half of them get the same messages, but coupled with an age progressed image of themselves. They would have to upload a photo. And the folks who got the age progressed photo were a little bit more likely to make a contribution to their called personal pension. It's the same as like a 401k here.
Wow.
idea behind this, it's not that you just have to like show somebody, right? It's about the vividness, right? So, some researchers did this in Kenya with rural Kenya, and it was just a study on women, and they had them go through sort of a vividness, like an imagery exercise about their future selves. And afterwards, they were more likely to save. They were more likely to use sort of like chlorine tablets. Chlorine tablets, did I get that right? Sorry. Basically, they were more likely to use tablets to clean the water to prevent digestive issues for their kids, right? And so, which is sort of a version of preparing, taking preventative action for the future self. That's more in the health space rather than the saving space, right? The gist is all there, right? It's all about making the future more vivid.
Maybe more vivid, because it's very blurry for us, right? Like if I think of my future self, you have a good image in your book of like you're scanning the crowd of a baseball game, say, and the reason that directors, when you're watching sports events, tend to kind of focus in on like one person's reaction is because that makes more of a powerful impact on the viewer than like seeing like a crowd shot.
Yeah, no, it's funny. Yeah, because I remember MLB.com has these, you can download like old games, right?
Yeah.
And I remember there was a period of time where like, I don't know why, but I would like if I was on like a long flight, sometimes I would like watching like an old game. Like I kind of
I love it. I love it. When they used to classic ESPN, it's so interesting. Yeah.
Totally. It's super interesting. And so I remember watching like it's like a 1975. It was I think it was the Red Sox game where Carlton Fisk sort of points the,
right.
He
goes like this. He's throwing it like,
and he's doing the thing. And I was like, I want to watch this game. Everyone's talked about it. And one of the things I realized in watching it, I was like, it's really funny because you can't, I mean, the technology then was just like obviously not what it is now. And it was really hard to see people's faces.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking like, who are those people? Like, what are they doing now? Like, or how many of them are even alive now?
Right. To remember that. Yeah.
And then, you watch a baseball game now and it's like they zoom right in and
you'd see all the reactions of the players on the field.
All the reactions of the players on the field, the people in the crowd. And I can spin out a story about each of those. And I think, that our future selves are a little like the old film, right? It's like real blurry until we sort of use some sort of imagination aid to sharpen the image.
Yeah. I mean, it strikes me, not to tie this back to writing, but for all the writers,
do it.
It's such an example of good writing too. So it's like, when you're writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, doing kind of a broad stroke description of something is not as effective as like talking about, a very specific detail. I mean, good writing is all in the details. And so it strikes me as like that kind of really works for writing as well. I mean, we talked already about journalism where, like I'm realizing today that I woke up this morning reading about these fires that are happening in Maui. We were just in Maui a few months ago, or maybe half a year ago. And so I know a lot of these pieces, and the New York Times headline is like 36 people dead, and it's very sad, but that like the more powerful story is going to be like the individual stories. Like if you're writing about that might be, and I don't know if I'm saying callous here bring that up, but that if the way to make it more vivid is to really find the individual stories, of heroism or tragedy, etc. So yeah, I think it's a great example in life and a great example in writing of like, there's power in focus in details.
Well, it's really true. It's funny because sometimes I think or like, at least I do on the academic side, I think, the right thing is to get all the information out there, and you can only do so at a certain, level, or, I can really zoom in on a detail, and it's so much more powerful to do the latter,
right,
than the former.
One other, and not to always talk about money here, but another, I don't know if it was a study or something that you brought up in the book that I thought was interesting, was that people were told that they could either get $5 a day or $150 a month, which would they choose? Right. Well, so the majority what was that? Tell me a little bit.
It was a study about saving, right? So it was these were folks, this was Acorns. I don't know if you know Acorns. It's like it's a savings app, and it's actually a Southern California company, and these are folks who are signing up to try to help them save a little bit more. And when they signed up for their account, we sort of asked them a follow-up question, and we said, hey, now that you're signed up, do you want to save? Do you want to enroll in an automatic savings account, right? So that, money is just always automatically coming out of your checking account, going into your investment account. And we divided people into groups. In one group, we said, do you want to save $150 a month? Another group, we said, do you want to save $35 a week? And another group, we said, do you want to save $5 a day? And it all adds up to the same, about the same, right? And 4 times as many people signed up when it was $5 a day. About 30% of the folks signed up when it was $5 a day, compared to when it was $150 a month. That was about 7%. And I mean, it's remarkable because it's the same amount of money, but $5 sounds and feels, on a subjective level, man, it feels a lot easier. Like I can think of a bunch of things, that I spend $5 a day on, and I'd say let me give that up. It's a much smaller category when I start to say, well, what do I spend $150 a month on? Now all of a sudden that's a smaller category, and it becomes tighter to say, like, well, what would I give up in that category, right? Now, of course, after about a month, there are certain people who drop out, when there's who signed up for $5 a day because they're like, oh shit, that's actually $150 a month.
But there's something psychologically about doing it in small chunks than
and part of the thinking there, this is a totally different sort of line of thought. It's not about connecting to our future selves per se, but it's about recognizing that a lot of this sort of back and forth between present and future selves, it's always the present self who is, like, quote unquote, sacrificing. That's the version who's got to spend less. That's the version of me who's got to, eat healthier and go to bed earlier and all these things. And that's no fun. So part of the thinking in that particular project was, can we make the present day sacrifices, and I'm putting quotes around that again, feel subjectively easier to undertake so that people are more likely to go through with them? I actually did this, when I was writing the book. The idea of, I'm sure this is something that you and, folks listening do really well, but it's like the idea of being like, I'm going to write, a 7,000 word chapter in the next 3 weeks. That's really daunting.
Yeah.
And then, I would try to break it down. It's like, okay, I'm not even, let's just ignore word count for a second, because that's kind of
random.
Yes, right. let me just do this about time. Like, what if I blocked off 2 hours today? And then it's even then sometimes I would say, like, what if I just started writing for like 5 minutes? And I would do these little tricks with myself. It's like, because once you start, it's like, sometimes if I'm really lazy, I'll try to think about this with, like, going on a walk or a run. Like, what if I just went for 5 minutes and then, like, maybe another 5 minutes? And I know what I'm trying to do.
No, there's something about, that's why, you're right. A lot of writers will say, I'm going to just write, or they'll be like, somebody told me, like, I'm just going to write for an hour and a half. Another writer had it, and she just did an hour and a half chunks. So it was like, I'm going to write for an hour and a half today. I'm going to turn off my phone, and whatever comes. But it's like, that's easier than I'm going to spend, the entire day writing. Like, I'm going to write today. I'm going to write my book today. Like, it's intense. It's just the way your mind. Why is that?
It's funny because I think part of it is that the bigger task is more daunting than the smaller, right?
Of course.
I think we also know from experience that you set up the bigger, I'm going to write all day. It's easier to say, well, I don't need to get started right now. Like, okay, I'm going to get started right now, but, like, actually, let me, like, go. I want to go check out Twitter. I want to go check out whatever. And you end up wasting time, right? And so I think, and this is like more of a productivity conversation than but it is also about making the present easier. I also, one of the other things that sort of matters here, right, is, saying, okay, I'm going to work for 2 hours today. Occasionally you've had that sort of burst where by the end of the 2 hours, you really start, okay, it's clicking, or 3 hours, whatever it is. I've found, and I think others have too, it's important to still stop. Because if you kind of just keep going, you could sort of burn out. But the other thing that's really nice about this is that, let's say that you get one of those bursts of energy and you're writing and it comes at the end of your block. Well, it's going to be a lot easier to pick it up again the next day.
Yeah.
Because I remember exactly the seed that I had planted before. You know, I mean, social psychologists talk about channel factors. Channel factors are, you know, you think about water flows down a channel, it goes the easiest way it can go.
Yeah.
Downhill, downstream, whatever. People are the same way. And one of the things that early social psychologists recognize is if I open up the channel factors and I make it easier to go from point A to point B, I'm more likely to get someone to take an action.
Right.
And so if I open up the channel factor by, you know, one of my old colleagues, Danny Oppenheimer, taught me this. He was like, if you're writing and you're doing well, don't close outward. Don't even turn off your computer. Just leave it open. And the next morning when you wake up, it's the first thing you see. Just get right back into it, right? And it opens up that channel, you know, rather than, okay, tomorrow morning I'll start fresh. Well, before I open up my, you know, document, let me check the news. Let me do this. Let me do that, you know. And it's like it puts friction in where you would actually do better by removing it.
When you were writing your book, and your future self, did you imagine a future Hal? Like, was there did you put what you were writing about into practice? Like, did you think about like, okay, I'm going to be in 3 or whatever it took you a year, I'm going to be talking on a podcast and I'm with John Small, you know, whatever. And I'm going to be, you know, tell me, like, how did you, like, is it useful when you're embarking on a project like writing a book, which is like, and we've already talked about this, like it's better to break it up into chunks, but is it useful? Is there any use in kind of imagining the finished product and you with a book?
Yeah. You know, what's funny. In that particular case, I leaned more into the breaking things into chunks than the, like, let me picture me on the other side of this, because it was daunting. I only started doing more of that. The like, oh, I'll be talking about this, you know, with you on a podcast, or, you know, maybe at a bookstore or whatever it is. I only did more of that toward the end, because then it became a little bit more real and vivid. Maybe that would be motivational to others. You know, one thing we do know is that ideal images of the future, I don't even think I was able to have the space to get into this in the book, but if we idealize the future and come up with like a positive fantasy, ironically, that can lower our motivation to do anything. You know, I could sit here and I have this image of, you know, whatever that ideal image of the author looks like.
Yeah.
And there's something nice about that. It gives you some energy. And then I sit back and it's like, go about my day doing other things. If you have that sort of fantasy about the future, but then you couple it with reality and you say, okay, where's the contrast between now and later? And this is research by Gabrielle Oettingen at NYU, if anybody's interested. She has a great book called, oh, shoot. Well, I think it's called, you know what? I'm sorry. Oettingen. Oettingen. Yeah.
Okay.
And you know, one of the things that she talks about is mental contrasting. Say, make a contrast between the current state of affairs in your world and that ideal image, and then sort of say, well, what are the obstacles? What stands in the way of it? How can I really get between point A and point B? But then really break it down and make it specific, right? And you know, like literally, okay, tomorrow from 8 to 11, that's when I'm going to work on this thing. So to answer your question, I did more of the like, how can I make the present easier so I can eventually get to my future self, than the like sort of like concrete imagery around the like end goal, the future self who is like turning in the manuscript.
Right. So let's talk about, if you're listening to this and you're not, say, a company trying to get people to plan for their future, you know, or, you know, save more today or save more in a month. And you're just a regular person going about their day. Is there a practice that you think is helpful in bridging the gap between your present and personal self, future self? Is there a practice that you think it is useful and could make you a more sort of successful, flourishing person? Like, I mean, tell me that, because I was very intrigued by this idea of writing a letter to your future self.
So that would be one of the main things I would
talk to me about that. What is that? What would that be?
One of the main things I would start with is let's call it a conversation between current and future selves. So, I would start first by thinking a little bit about, let's identify a time point in the future. Maybe let's think about what are some of the goals and sort of hope for ideals.
Yeah.
Think about that time period. Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years from now? And then the exercise I really like is to write a letter to that future self, but then write a letter back from that future self. Step into the shoes of that future self and write a letter back from that future self to your current self now. And the reason I like that so much is because I think it really sort of ups the empathy. It forces you to step into your shoes of the future self and see the world through their eyes. But then I wouldn't stop there, right? I would say, okay, well, now, this is really helpful for sort of the big things and the big picture. But now on a day-to-day level, what are the problems? What are the barriers, right? So, when I think about writing, this is a good case for one of the sort of strategies I talk about in the book is what researchers call pre-commitments. And the idea is I sort of I have this present self. I have this self who's like, yeah, you know what? I want these good things for my future self. And I have this future self who's like, he's the guy that's going to look back and say, yeah, I did these things. Like I wrote this thing, or I exercised, or whatever it is. But then there's the middle guy who fucks it up, right? The guy who's going to be like, sleep in, or, go like deep on, some sort of YouTube rabbit hole or whatever, and then look up and the day has gone by and I haven't done anything. And so part of the strategy of pre-commitments is to say, well, let me figure out how I can put some guardrails on my behavior in the future so that I can constrain it to do the things that I want to do. It's, this is something I did put into practice. When I was writing the book, what was the app called? There's an app called Forest. And do you know this one? It's
I don't. I'm excited.
It's kind of, I don't know. There's something about it that seems so silly. But you set a little timer and you set a timer for 30 minutes or something like that. And, a little like tree grows on your screen. And, if you touch your screen, you do something else, sets back to 0, and that you have to replant your tree. Talking about this out loud, it sounds so silly.
It sounds very Southern California, but I like it because the idea is that it's like, instead of having a timer, like a little clicking timer, it's a tree growing, right? There's something a little bit more.
Yeah. And it was like, I would put it there. I'd put it like right next to my computer. And like, part of what was nice about it was it'd say, I only have to stay focused for 30 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And look, I mean, I guess technically I could have gone to another website on my computer or something like that, but it was like, let me see what I can do here. And the reason I like this is it put some guardrails. It said, the thing I'm guilty of is the moment that I hit some tension of like, I don't know what the right next sentence is going to be. That's when I go down the sort of procrastination rabbit hole. Right. Yeah. And so, another version of this that I've done, I don't know if others have done, is, I've written with somebody else, like on Zoom, and like I've shared my screen and they're working too, but like it would be embarrassing to like click over to do something else every time I hit tension, right? And so it's like it's a constraint again. Right. So that's another sort of like practical.
So it's like knowing what your future self might do, and then creating guardrails to avoid.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. There's some sophistication required there.
Yeah.
And what I mean by sophistication, like you have to sort of have a recognition of like where are your your pitfalls. And also you have to, I mean, one of the versions of this that I love, by the way, is there's a website called stick.com with 2 Ks where I can say, okay, my goal is, I have a goal of writing 2 hours a day, or at least sitting down for 2 hours a day. And John, you're going to be my like accountability partner. And every week you're going to check in with me and ask me, did I do it? And by the way, I'm going to give my credit card number to the website and like the name of a quote unquote anti-charity.
I've done this. Yes. I don't know if it would stick. Yeah. I was giving money to the NRA if I didn't finish.
There you go.
Exactly.
There you go. And
right.
like, man, that's like, I don't want to do that. Right.
Yeah,
mine would be the same charity as yours.
Right. Right. So interesting. By the way, in talking about apps, I think you brought up another app that I hadn't heard of, and you'll tell me the name of where you can actually write this letter to yourself and have
Yeah.
your future. What do you remember what it was called? It was
Future Me,
Future
futureme.org. Yeah, it's
That's
really
great.
lovely because you can do one of these letters. Now that's just a 2-letter, but there's nothing stopping you from sort of writing the from letter.
Yeah,
But you give it your email address and set a time, and it comes back to you.
it'll come back to you. That's so awesome. So
Wow.
it's actually an email, which is probably easier for people to understand. Most of my listeners who don't write letters, and I don't think
I
I've
was
written
gonna
a
say,
letter.
I
What it
mean,
was is this not 1890? Where you write
one
letters,
of my,
my
it's
dearest.
funny. My best friend from childhood, he sent me
Oh my God.
an actual letter and says to future Hal, and he pretended
future.
that it was written in the year 2050 and made
That's
some very
awesome.
funny. It was hilarious. I had no idea he was that creative, and it was making predictions about what each of our kids are doing. It was
That is so cute.
Very funny. Very funny.
Well, that kind of brings me one of the last questions here is like, what, let's say you were meeting your future self in 5 years. What would you ask your future self? Like, what have you thought about that conversation that you,
I've
tell me a little bit about it. Yeah. Tell me about what you would ask. And maybe we'll take it again. Like, what would your future self tell present Hal? Let's first talk about what you would tell your future self or ask your future self.
It's funny because that I opened the book by talking about this short story by Ted Chiang,
which I have to read. What is it called? It's like something.
It's called the Merchant and the Alchemist Gate.
Yeah, sounds really.
And it is I'm not like a sci-fi fan necessarily. It's the most moving. I can say this without a doubt. It's the most moving short story I've ever read.
So set it up for us. That the basic premise is what
there's this guy kind of walks to a shop, and there's an alchemist there, and there's a gate, and if he walks through the gate, he can talk to his future self in 20 years time.
Yeah.
And it just creates all these interesting scenarios of what do you want to know and what do you want to in this case, the future self is wise and doesn't tell the current self certain things. So there's an element of surprise, and which is so much of life, right? And so I had earlier on thought I want to know everything, and in reading that story made me realize I think I don't, because I'd want to know sort of broad strokes, like, and even then, if I said, well, are my kids healthy? What happens if he said no?
Yeah.
I mean,
it's
God,
like
that would
going
change.
to a psychic when they start telling you bad thing, except this is real.
Yeah,
like you don't want to know.
Real.
Like I'd rather just not know. Yeah.
And it's like, and then it becomes this whole thing where can you change things? It's like, no, let's start from the premise that you can't change anything. I'd honestly want to know, do things turn out all right? And is there anything I should do more of? And of course it gets tricky, because then if I do more of it, does it change things? I can't, my mind can't grapple with all those possibilities right now, but, and then, right. If I were to be that guy, that future self, and step back to now, I would, in a way, this is what I do a lot of this is how I sort of incorporate a lot of the research into my own life, is like it's more about creating a conversation where I try to think, what will that guy feel positive about? What will he look back on regretfully about my behavior now? And so much of this now, by the way, is about, my kids and how I interact with them. And when I lose my temper and, and when I'm present or not present. And those are the conversations that I'm having. And those are the things I'd want him to remind, that's what I would remind this version of me about, is you only have this period of time once. So
it's so great.
Lean into
Hal,
it.
thank you so much for, I know you got to get out, and I want to give 2 minutes to ask you this other question, but Hal Hershfield, the book is called Your Future Self, How to Make Tomorrow Better Today. It's a fantastic book. Hal, thank you so much for coming on the show. And
thanks, John. This is a really fun conversation.